I'm Alana. I use they and she pronouns.
And I'm Jessie. I use she and her pronouns.
And we're
we're
making
making
mentions.
mentions. Making Mentions is an organization providing radical Jewish education.
And this is the Artist Series, where we showcase queer, Jewish, anti-Zionist artists. Today, we're talking to Naomi Weintraub. Introduce yourself, tell us your pronouns, where you call home. If I butchered your name, please tell us now. Astrological sign, if you're into that, and what kind of art you make.
Hi, I'm Naomi Weintraub. I use they, them pronouns, and my astrological sign is Libra. I'm a multimedia artist and educator. I live in Baltimore, Maryland, on the lands of Piscataway and Susquehannock peoples, and I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah, for joining us. Okay, so we're just going to jump in and go wherever you want with this question. What was your relationship to Judaism growing up, and how does it show up in your life now?
Cool. So I grew up in Maryland in Silver Spring. So there's a pretty big Jewish community there. That there's also just big communities of a lot of different groups of people. Learned a lot about El Salvadorian culture and Ethiopian culture from living in Silver Spring, which was cool. And I grew up going to a Reconstructionist synagogue in the DC area, which was cool and definitely helped me with some of these ideas around like taking Judaism and Jewish rituals seriously and leaving space for interpretation, which was really great. And sometimes I also felt like there was too much space for interpretation. I wanted a little bit more structure. Choice is overwhelming sometimes. But I'm really close with my family, and I think coming together around Jewish ritual was just a really central part of how we did things as a family and how we made community. And so that's always been a big piece. I also grew up going to socialist Jewish summer camp, and I think that also really reminded me how rebellious and fun and silly and just super community focused Jewish spaces and Judaism is. And I think growing up, having that space in the summer was really necessary just because it's just hard to be Jewish in the US sometimes or just in the world. And I think it felt like a release to be around in a specifically Jewish space with other kids my age was a huge part of my relationship to Judaism growing up.
That's incredible. I feel like we've spoken to other people who have been to socialist Jewish summer camps, and I am deeply jealous of that experience. It just sounds very cool and very freeing. I just feel like I would have come to a lot of realizations much earlier in life had I been surrounded by that sort of Jewish community instead of the Jewish community that I was surrounded by.
Yeah, it's interesting too. Something I say when I talk about it that I omit, it was also a labor Zionist camp. And I think a lot of people in the Jewish community know that Jewish summer camps are pretty Zionist. So sometimes I don't say it just because it's implied. But it's actually a really important part of me rejecting Zionism and becoming an anti-Zionist and specifically an anarchist was being and learning about Zionism at a really young age. And it was within a Zionist lens, but I was learning about the occupation much younger than most of my non-Jewish peers. And it was extremely painful, but it paved the way for me to be able to really intentionally reject Zionism. And it also taught me how to organize around that and around rejecting Zionism. And I feel like a much more confident anti-Zionist Jew now because I'm not confused. It's very clear to me. And I think part of that is because there's some humanness in it, I think, and understanding a transformation that has to happen in order to really unlearn a lot of things that are brainwashed to us as young Jewish Americans.
Yeah, 100%. We spoke to someone named Zohar, who I'm wondering if you went to the same camp as Zohar now, because they also went to a labor Zionist socialist Jewish summer camp. And I don't really know how many of those there are, but a lot of what you're saying feels very familiar to that conversation that we had with Zohar in terms of really learning the ins and outs of Zionism and specifically labor Zionism from a very young age, and therefore or an earlier age than most other, at least anti-Zionist Jews that I know do, and therefore being able to reject it with knowledge backing that beyond just something about this feels icky. It's no, I have this knowledge of it to inform this decision, which I wish, yeah, I just wish there was more access to knowledge as young people that wasn't so filtered.
Yeah, and something that is interesting, also, I'm sure they went to a camp like mine or mine, I'm not sure, but a big piece of it too is a lot of Jewish summer camps are, and mine was a youth-led camp specifically. There was a mentorship built in, and something that's pretty cool is some of my mentors or counselors that I had at camp went on to start If Not Now, or went on to do a bunch of stuff in JVP. And so there was some clear path of, oh, I can choose to do something else, or I can go to someone and say, what the hell were you teaching me 5 years ago and why? And some of those relationships have been more clear and helpful, and others have been a little more heartbreaking, but it's helped me with now as an educator and working with young Jewish people, being really explicit and honest and transparent. And it's important to me to come to Jewish spaces as I am now, I think, too, because I experienced a lot of deception and mystification of things that are not mystical.
Yeah, I'm excited for the future of Jewish education with more Jewish educators who are anti-Zionist or at least non-statist. I think some other folks
Yeah.
is. And
It's hard though. Something I talk about a lot is I experienced this in my synagogue and really intensely at my camp. I just remember experiencing a lot of simulations and experiential things. So at my synagogue growing up, we simulated the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire and we're locked in
what?
a room. It is super unnecessary. Or at camp, we simulated just lots of things that we didn't need to go through the somatic experience of doing again. And I think now people have a little bit better idea of how somatics work. People have a little bit a better understanding of inherited trauma that a lot of Jewish young people have. And it is definitely informing more responsible education. It's interesting. I think I've also been a queer, anti-Zionist anarchist working Hebrew school jobs basically my whole life. And it's really hard. And I work at a Jewish institution now and it's hard. And when I see people who I look up to and the work they're doing, or, oh, you work at this place and you're an anarchist, but you by day do this or whatever. I think people need to be a little bit more honest sometimes about how difficult it can be and how lonely it can feel too. And Jewish ritual and Jewish community, like having a space for praying and having a space for holidays and having time with my family is like one of the only ways I've been able to continue to do work in the Jewish community. So it's both like I need it and I am struggling with it, which is very Jewish.
Yeah, I feel like Jesse could probably speak much more to the ins and outs of being a anti-Zionist Jewish person working within Jewish institutions. I feel like I haven't even bothered, honestly, to try because I am not interested in being in a space where I have to combat different politics at all times. That just is not what I need out of a job that pays me. So
That's really
truly
fair.
props to y'all for doing the work because it is super, super important.
Yeah, honestly, I feel really lucky too. I work at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. I work there as the community artist in residence for the past 2 years through a program that's sponsored at Maryland Institute College of Art, MICA. It's like a grant through MICA, and then my residency is at the Jewish Museum, and I'm really lucky to be able to do that work. And now I'm continuing, but under a different title, but similar. And my first day there, every doorway has a mezuzah. And I don't know, just things like that. It's a secular Jewish institution that's focused on history and cultural organizing. And they have mezuzahs on every door frame, and not everyone there is Jewish. I also want to say I feel really lucky. I think that there's certain escapes from Christian hegemony that I get to experience at work every day that greatly benefits my mental health and well-being. And I want that for all Jewish people. And I think in workspaces I've been in that aren't Jewish organizations or something, I brought my own mezuzah along. Not literally, but metaphorically. And that's hard too. And so, yeah, I think it's just pick your poison.
Yeah, honestly, I always feel my dream would just be to be able to do making mentions full time and live off of that because that would fully be best of both worlds. Because you're so right. Working in spaces that are not at all Jewish is taxing in a completely different way.
I think it's exciting when young people are saying that too, because I still feel so much younger than a lot of Jewish professionals. And I think there's this idea that young people aren't interested in Judaism or Jewish community. And I think we're actually just creating our own things. And these big synagogues and stuff are just angry. We don't want to spend $1 million on their memberships, but it's happening. Yeah. So it's interesting.
I want to pivot us because you talked about your art
Yeah, let's do
briefly
it.
in terms of already where your art and identities are intersecting, being able to work as a artist in residence basically at a Jewish space. but we're curious how your identities impact your art or show up in your art. And that could be any of the identities that you hold.
That's a good question. Yeah, I've been making art my whole life, but I focused on visual art around the end of high school and then got to college and didn't go to a school that had a very robust art program, but had some stuff. And was like, I'm just gonna take one class and see how I feel. And then was like, oh shit, this is everything. And I also studied good community education at the same time as studying art. And I did a lot of organizing around Jewish community and anti-Zionism in college as well. And so I think the first time I was formally learning and training in art, especially thinking about art conceptually, was at the same time as coming as non-binary, as doing the most anti-Zionist organizing I had done in a long time, realizing I was an anarchist, leaving my labor Zionist youth movement, but making a big mess there first. And so I think a lot of the time my art is just a reaction or response of what I'm working on and through my organizing or through my own personal journey. So in that way, it's always been very linked. But in 2018, the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh definitely shifted things in my art making. At the time, my sibling was working at one of the synagogues in that building, but they weren't there that day, which is good. But they were a Jewish educator in that space. And so they were doing a lot of organizing in Pittsburgh and a lot of supporting young people at that synagogue specifically. And me and them and our friend, in response to that, created an art piece. It said "Care Not Cops," and it was talking about not turning to a police response in the face of anti-Semitism. And that kind of got picked up. And I think that really put into focus that we wanted to be creating more art that was specifically anarchist and Jewish. And so me and my friend and my sibling put together something called RAGE, which stands for Rebellious Anarchist Young Jews Collective. And that was really the first time I was super focusing on creating Jewish anarchist propaganda specifically. After a long time of researching and being empowered by other people doing that, I really put my head to the iron or whatever the saying is and really focused on that. And the collective has shifted and it's just me and my sibling now. And we're moving a lot slower these days around making propaganda, but we're both still working as artists and writer. They're a writer, I'm an artist, so we meld. And one thing I want to say is just the Tree of Life had a really profound impact on a clear statement around how we can choose to react to anti-Semitism as a Jewish community. But it was really Jewish time that guides and pushed this kind of work for me. And by Jewish time, specifically leaving the Gregorian calendar mindset. And I've been able to do that through projects that have been really helpful, like the Olam Haba planner that Rebecca Arab and Naomi Lamb do. So if people don't know, they do a planner that's based on the Hebrew calendar and also is anti-Zionist. So it has Nakba Day and May Day and other things, and also is very magical. And it's been a really important technology for me in entering around the Jewish calendar. And a lot of my work does, it'll be, oh, Tu B'Av is coming up. What do I want to say about that? And what kind of ideas are coming up? And since starting at the Jewish Museum as the artist in residence, that's looked more like creating programming or specific things through the museum, because that's just where I am every day. But I also make art and don't share it sometimes. And I think that's been really helpful because, especially as an anti-Zionist, I think there's always something at all times. It is a horrible thing that is happening in Palestine. And I think the occupation is atrocious. And also it seems that there's moments when US news, especially lefty US news, picks it up and gets excited and people are posting all over social media. And I'm really not interested in those moments of reaction. I'm more interested in creating artwork and organizing that focuses on a long-term vision of ending the occupation and liberation of Palestine. So using my own sense of time to anchor when I create something and when I'm bringing attention has felt a lot more empowering and useful than some of the propagandists that I see, which they're awesome. I love all those stuff on Instagram, but it can be really intense. The just pieces that are made in reaction to certain things that happen. I think it puts a big focus on what's not working instead of creating art that helps people imagine what we are looking for and what we're dreaming of.
Yeah. And you've really explored the idea of Jewish magic and Jewish time. And I think what sounds like from the audio, returning to a ancestral homeland of sorts through this piece that I was very deeply invested in. I am rhizome. Am I saying that correctly?
I'm a rhizome, yeah.
Yeah. And I'm so curious. I know there's a part of the Rebecca era recording in it and these communal values about rejecting this oppression and white supremacy that's been put upon us. And anyway, I was just wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit about that, the evil eye, magic, anything.
Yeah, totally. Yay. I'm excited. Yeah, so I've been working on an installation that was just on view at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. It's called I'm a Rhizome and So Are You. And it really focuses on exploring research I've been doing for a long time around ancestral wisdom, Jewish magic, ecology, queer resistance. And it really is an installation that comes out of work that comes from another installation I created that I want to share about first, which was in college. I created an installation called Jewish Ritual as Rebellion, which was two stop motion animation projected videos into a corner. And it just talked about using Jewish ritual as an anchor for our activism and for rejecting the status quo and white supremacy and Christian hegemony and heteronormativity. It's cool because it was at the beginning of me taking myself seriously as a Jewish artist specifically. I had just gotten art into the radical Jewish calendar. I remember when my art got accepted into that, I was like, I'm a Jewish radical artist. It's happening. This is my dream come true. And something that is so sweet about that is my co-host and co-producer of the podcast at the Jewish Museum, this loyal podcast, shameless plug, Mark Gunnery. He's my supervisor and comrade in Baltimore and works with me at the museum. And he was also in that calendar that year. He also had art. And at the time I was living in Worcester, Massachusetts, and he was in Baltimore, and we didn't connect at that moment. But our art was in this same technology and the same tool. And it's been really powerful a few years later to be in real community with him. So that installation was really also inspired by Rebecca Erev, who's an artist in Kohenet and just general badass and extremely generous. Lots of newsletters with tons of content that has been really helpful education for me and been my free version of Jewish magic school just by reading those emails. And at the time, Rebecca Erev was doing a project called Queer Mikveh Project. And that really was one of the first times I had seen artists queering Jewish ritual practices. And Rebecca was in partnership with Nikki Green, I think, during that. And Nikki Green is an amazing trans artist who's Jewish and does a lot of ceramics that are amazing. I just bring that all up to say that it really started with those people and looking at their work, and also Dory Midnight's work. I was really obsessed with her old website called Dorylandia or something. I just was obsessed with it and I would go on it all the time. And it just felt like these corners of the internet that were more colorful than the Jewish education I had experienced in some ways, and also just so gay and so anti-Zionist and not confused about that was really refreshing. A few years later, now I just created this installation, I'm a Rhizome and So Are You, and it features two 4 feet by 4 feet panels that are collaged. And the collages include a lot of stuff, which is cool. So some of the things that it includes is actual rhizomes I found on site of the Jewish Museum of Maryland. Rhizome is a kind of root, which is pretty cool because the campus is in Jonestown in Baltimore, Maryland, and it's the historic Jewish neighborhood, even though there isn't a huge Jewish community there now. The museum is right in between two historic synagogues, one the Lloyd Street Synagogue, which is still on view to visit, but isn't used as a synagogue, and then B'nai Israel Synagogue, which is actively still used as a synagogue. And so there's a lot of potent, intense, magical vibes on our campus, I would say. And so finding those rhizomes there felt like I really knew I wanted to use those for something. And I had already been thinking about rhizomes as a structure for organizing and learning and understanding myself, because rhizomes are decentralized, they are asymmetrical, they're ever going, shoots out, and I just like it. I like the word. I like it. And so I included those. There's also a really big hot pink rhizome that I illustrated on there. There's some cyanotypes that I had created actually for decorations for my sukkah last year. There's also 2 images. One is from a photo that my sibling took in Lithuania in the shtetl that our ancestors are from. They visited last summer. Yeah, I could talk about everything on it, but I think that would be a lot. It just is all to say part of the installation was really trusting my intuition of association, arranging things and feeling like, okay, this symbolically makes sense to me. And I don't think I need to spell it out, which is something I'm really working on in my art of just trusting my instincts and associations and hoping that it rings powerful for other people. But to bring it back to Rebecca Erev, the piece also has an audio clip that mirrors the audio clip of the installation I was talking about from undergrad. A few years ago, my dad found a tape of his grandparents, my great grandparents, singing Yiddish songs. And it's been the source of inspiration for many projects for me. And I just take different parts of it and mix it up and find different nuggets and translate different parts. And so that's part of the track. And then the other part of the track for the Rhizome installation is excerpts from an interview I did with Rebecca Erev for our podcast Disloyal about Tu B'Av, which is coming up actually, and about Jewish magic. And I specifically pulled pieces from us talking about evil eyes and the power that evil eyes have in being a protective amulet. And I don't think I'm in it, but in the interview itself, I talk a little bit about what that's meant to me. So yeah, it's all felt very full circle. And I do just want to say so much of why I'm able to do this stuff is because I have been blessed by a lot of generosity from older artists that I've reached out to and asked, hey, can we sit down and talk? Or I really admire you and just thank you. And then that brings nachas later. So yeah, that's just something I really want to be clear about. I feel like a lot of my work is based off of being a mega art nerd and fanboy.
So I was going to ask you about your podcast because I love the name Disloyal. And I was wondering if you wanted to elaborate a little bit about what went into choosing that name. And then there's also this awesome writing, which I'm now realizing might be your siblings on Rage about disloyal and embodying that and reclaiming that. So if you wanted to talk about that a little.
Awesome. Disloyal podcast was created right after a show at the Jewish Museum of Maryland that was called Fencer and the Torah, Safety and Unsafety in Jewish Life, which was curated by a community member actually. And it was right when I joined staff at the museum, and me and Ami, my sibling, were encouraged to submit work as our collective rebellious anarchist young Jews because the curator knew about our work. And so we put in work, and one of those pieces was a graphic that we created and an accompanying poem that Ami wrote called We Are Disloyal. And it was in a response to Trump saying something that Jews are disloyal, especially to the state. And the poem, it's really beautiful, and I really recommend people go read it. But the poem and the poster really served as one of the anchors of the exhibit, I would say, which is convenient because I also work at the museum, so easy to get permission to use these things. But then when we were deciding the name for the podcast and the intention, it really felt like that was a perfect name for it, because the podcast is really focused on what does it mean to be loyal and disloyal to a people, to a state, to an idea, to an artistic practice, to the Jewish community, and how are Jewish artists and Jewish people and community messing with the status quo is what the podcast is really focused on. And so, yeah, I co-host the podcast with my friend Mark Gunnery. And yeah, it's been a really interesting experience. Something that's really interesting about the podcast is that through asking people about their art and through the writing that they do or the cultural organizing that they do, people talk about their political alignments to Israel really naturally. And I think that's some of the power around being a Jewish person who also really is deeply focused on creative expression. It goes really hand in hand, I think, to people's political organizing and beliefs. And it's actually been also a challenge at the museum. We are trying to create space for people with a lot of different ideas and opinions, and balancing that is complicated and really a balancing act and a big lesson for me too in choosing your battles, I think, and thinking specifically towards long-term visions for the Jewish community has been helpful.
You've referenced both the amazing things of learning from our elders and past generations and also current older artists, and also seem to be referencing the struggle with some older people in our community who may not be as open-minded to certain ideas. And I'm curious how you think art can help us communicate with our elders and past generations, and also those who are amongst us who might not necessarily be on board all the time.
Yeah, it's interesting. I want to be explicit that I don't think it's about and I don't think this is what you were saying, but it's definitely not just generational. There's hella Zionists that are our age, and it's scary and weird. There's also hella transphobic people and TERFs, and they're all ages. But I think one thing that is interesting is just through art, music, writing, dance, creative expression, I think we're able to remind people about transformation and the power of it. Something that's been really helpful for me as a trans person is just remembering that I'm going through transformation, transitions, and so are cis people. And it's actually helped me a lot with having empathy for people who aren't understanding what I'm going through. And we're actually all going through different kinds of transformations and transitions. And I think that's also been helpful for me in some of the honestly unacceptable ideologies that are held up by the Jewish institutions. I'm really active in alternative Jewish spaces. I was involved in New Synagogue Project in DC, and now I'm really involved with Hinenu Baltimore Justice Stiebel. And both of those projects are really focused on creating alternatives outside of Jewish federations and Jewish institutions. And they bring hella people, and people are really into it. And I think that's idea to be reckoned with for a lot of these old school Jewish institutions that are focused on money and focused on allegiance to Israel blindly. I've been really wondering what it would be like to have more artists in residences at these older, more established Jewish synagogues and institutions, because I don't think that artists have the ability to censor themselves a lot of the time. And I think that it could be a powerful tool for understanding how someone can get to the ideas that they have and humanizing it. And also, I think artists should be doing that in partnership or community or collectively. I've been working with a lot of artists the past few years now, and no one's one piece of work alone is starting the conversation. It's a lot of people coming together and having that conversation. A lot of episodes of the Disloyal podcast where people are talking about Palestine. That made it so that we had to add a disclaimer to the front of our podcast where we're explicitly saying this podcast does not represent the views of everyone, blah, blah, blah. And I don't know, that's powerful. And yeah, I think that transformation piece is key.
Yeah. And even the fact that you're able to host a podcast connected to the Jewish Museum of Maryland to talk about anti-Zionism with people or talk about Palestine with people openly, I think it's pretty honestly incredible. I was genuinely surprised to see that they were connected. And I think that speaks to the Jewish Museum of Maryland in terms of their openness and willingness to listen and be open to various forms of wisdom and knowing. But yeah, I'm also so curious and think it would be really powerful to see artists in residence at other Jewish museums or Jewish institutions, and not just artists that they knew would reflect their values. Because I think it would be easy to pick and choose.
Yeah. And also, I'm so grateful for this opportunity I've had to work at the Jewish Museum of Maryland. And also, I've been censored out of a lot of other opportunities or been in other Jewish institutional fellowships or programs that I've had to quit and leave because I can't be there with my politics or the amount of queer I am. And that's painful and also a failure of the Jewish community. And I think it is about that decisiveness. And part of why I think I'm able to do this is because I really care about Jewish community and I really care about Jewishness, and it's meant a lot to me, and it's something I'm actively chasing every day, and I can't really remove it from what I'm doing. And I think that's a force to be reckoned with as well. I think it makes people uncomfortable to see me know the prayers and know ritual and know maybe more about Jewishness and whatever it means to know more. I think it's more just a self-assuredness or feeling confident in my relationship to Judaism is a force to be reckoned with for people who just want to chalk it up to my politics. So it all impacts each other. It's making me learn a lot about myself as we're talking.
I'm glad we're also learning a lot.
I think within the Jewish community, if you're confused about Zionism or Palestine, especially I think this is true for all Jewish people and also Jewish young queer people who are interested in anti-racism, you need to get over your Zionism first. I remember when, if not now, started really organizing people on college campuses. And my friend, who is Jewish, but hadn't been able to really experience Jewish community very much in their life, got really radicalized by If Not Now and excited to be part of the project. And I remember I hung out with them and I was like, hey, also just so you know, you deserve more than this too. You deserve more than just an organizing project to make yourself feel Jewish and have a Jewish space. You also deserve a synagogue and a bat mitzvah and praying and a mikvah and Rosh Hashanah and all of these things. I just think that's really important as well. I really encourage people to work through their own personal issues and trauma around the way they were taught about Zionism or their connection to it. If we want to be in true solidarity with Palestinians and also just be able to organize in the US right now around an international human rights crisis, you need to have figured out your own personal response and trauma around it. Because I've been noticing a lot of people, and by people I'm saying people within my community, Jewish people, responding with urgency and centering their own experiences. And I'm like, come on, we're in 2023. We don't need to do that anymore. It's very clear. But also, if that's where you're at in your journey, that's okay. But just know that's where you are and figure out your capacity around that and be seriously working around how to get past that stage.
You just said so many things at once that were things I wanted to pick up on. But I think that for Jewish people who don't feel super Jewish, and that's in quotes, or feel like they can't have Jewish community without Zionism, it is so important for those spaces to exist that are outside of organizing, because there's something that is so nourishing about being able to be in a Jewish space that is queer, radical, anti-Zionist, but not be talking about just those things, like just being Jewish and just saying prayers together and observing tradition and ritual together is an act of resistance and is radical to do that.
And we really need it. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in the US. And when I was most heavily involved in anarchist projects, I experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. And there's a lot of strength in coming to an organizing project as a Jewish person. And it's really hard.
Yeah. I think it's really hard to feel that you have to pick a community between your Judaism and your politics. And I think there's a lot of imagining to do around political spaces that can also be spiritual and religious spaces, like you were saying. And we deserve more than having to pick a potentially hostile, vaguely anti-Semitic space that is aligned with our other politics and super Zionist religious space that makes us feel a little bit at home, but also super alienated and isolated.
I also just think in general, organizing spaces are really secular. I just want to be clear. I also have seen the ways in which my friends and comrades who are Muslim have experienced hard times in anarchist and social justice spaces for just being into praying. And specifically in the US, any secular space is a Christian hegemonic space, and that we need to be realizing that as well. And I think especially once I started realizing some of that, I was realizing how little space there was left for me to talk about Jewishness without it becoming a whole thing. And that's not really what I'm dreaming of either. I don't want to make myself small.
And that's beautiful because that leads us right into our wrap up about dreaming of something beautiful for the future or leaving our listeners with one message. What would you like to leave with?
Okay, I'll leave them with this. I guess the thing I want to leave listeners with is a real invitation. I know we're still in July, but High Holidays is basically already here. And I think that the days of awe are a really exciting time to assess what clock you're on. And there's queer time, there's Jewish time, there's crypt time, there's all these ideas of how we can restructure ourselves away from capitalism, white supremacy, Zionism, just general hegemony. And I'm just wondering what it would be like for people to use that time to think about if they want to switch the clock they're on. And there's a lot of really great resources around that. And I really recommend the Olam Haba planner. I recommend looking up a lefty shul in your area or calling a friend. And honestly, the internet is just, there's a lot out there that you can read and get plugged into. Can I plug a few things? I want to recommend a book for people that I feel didn't get enough attention. It's edited by Cindy Milstein, who's a friend of mine, and it's an anthology called There's Nothing So Whole as a Broken Heart, Mending the World as Jewish Anarchists. And if you were interested in some of the stuff I was talking about on the podcast, it's all in that book. My collective has a piece in it, and my sibling has a piece in it, and lots of other friends that I cherish are in that anthology. And I think it's a really good starting point for understanding what it means to be a Jewish anarchist right now. And it's also a work in progress, and it came out during the pandemic, so I haven't seen it in the wild much. And I really encourage people to check it out if you're curious about Jewish anarchism. There's also another book. I'm just going to plug that one too. Ana Elena Torres just came out with a book called With Freedom in Our Ears, Histories of Jewish Anarchism. I think it was written also with Kenyon Zimmer. It's an anthology, so it has other artists and writers too. And I've just started reading it, but it's all about the history of radical Jewish life and culture. Those are just really good starting points. And I also just want to say, if you're reading some cool anarchist pieces, there's a good chance they might be Jewish or they have Jewish friends. And just thinking about that is exciting and interesting. So we're in good company.
Thank you so much for those plugs. I'm definitely going to include all of the links to things that we've talked about during today's episode in the description of the podcast. So if you're listening to this right now and you wanted to check something out, all of the links will be in the description. But we just wanted to thank you for coming on the podcast and taking time to talk with us about your art and your Judaism and anarchism and queerness and the way that all of those things overlap. I think it's always just nice to talk to people who are in similar spaces, reading similar things. Like Jesse and I also both, I think, really love the Olam Haba planner. And I feel like everything that you said about Jewish time and queer time is something that resonates really strongly with me personally. And I think that I love the message that you left on. I do hope that people can start to learn to function outside of capitalism, because that's the only way we're going to start to move away from it, is if we just simply start to do it. So yes, thank you for all the bits of wisdom. Thank you for being here. Is there any other work you want to highlight that you didn't plug already?
Sure. My new friend, Scott Branson, has a book out that's called Practical Anarchism, A Guide for Daily Life. And Scott's a Jewish trans writer. And this book is a really great entry point for people who are interested in anarchism. And I just really recommend it. If people are interested in my work, I finally launched my website through Google Sites, but I'm trying to make that the cool new thing for people to do. So this is the URL, but you can also find it at my Instagram, which is Naomi Rose, but zeros for the O's. And then my website is sites.google.com/view/Naomi Rose Weintraub/home. So that really rolls off the tongue, but you can also just find it at my Instagram, which I think they'll link. So yeah, check out my work. And I'm really interested in being in conversation and learning from people. So please DM me. I will respond.
Yay, we love that. We'll also be tagging Naomi's website in our description, but you should also just go to their Instagram and check out some of the artwork on there as well.
I'm team follow back.
Oh, there you go. So go get a follow back and also talk to them about Jewish anarchism and art and all the things. We'll be back next week with Astera, who is a Sephardi writer, pianist, and photographer living in Spain. So if you've joined us today for this episode with Naomi, come back next week and we're going to be talking to Astera then.
Awesome.
Thanks for being here, Naomi.
Thanks for having me. Bye.